Hi, and welcome to episode 22, Handling Client Pushback on Your Policies. What to say when a client tests the line. I'm Lisa Reidsema, and welcome to episode 22. Every therapist in private practice eventually meets the client who pushes back on a policy. It might be the cancellation fee, it might be the late arrival policy, the limits around texting between sessions, or the fee itself. Sometimes the pushback is direct and you can see it coming across the room. More often, it arrives quietly as a pattern of small tests that never quite cross a clear line. The way that you handle those moments shapes the treatment relationship more than almost anything else that you do. So it also shapes how you feel about your own work at the end of the day. Today, I want to talk about why this is generally hard for therapists, how to tell the difference between flexibility and erosion, and what to actually say when a client pushes. So, part one, the pushback is not a crisis. Let me start by naming the thing directly. If you have a private practice, you will have a client who doesn't want to follow one of your policies. This is not a sign that you set your policies wrong, and it's not a sign that you have a difficult client. It's simply what happens when you run a practice with real boundaries and real people walk into it. So the cancellation fee is the most common place this shows up. A client books the time is held, and then the client does not come and doesn't want to pay. The late policy is another one. A client who arrives 20 minutes into a 50-minute session and expects the full hour. Push later to make up for the difference. Communication is a third. The client who texts on a Saturday was something that's genuinely distressing to them and then not an emergency, and who feels hurt when you don't answer until Monday. None of these situations is a clinical emergency, and I want to be careful here because the instinct many of us have is to treat them as one. A client pushing on a policy is not a rupture that has already happened. It's just a moment that could become a rupture if you handle it badly, and it's also a moment that can actually strengthen the relationship if you handle it well. So the pushback itself is neutral. What you do next is what matters. Part two, why this is hard for therapists specifically. So, here is something I believe is under discussed. The exact training that makes you a good clinician is the training that makes policy conversations really difficult. So, you were taught to understand behavior in context, and you were taught to hold complexity, to look underneath the surface of what someone does, and to avoid shaming people for the ways they have learned to protect themselves. Those are good instincts, and they belong in the room during clinical work. The problem is that those same instincts turned toward a policy conversation will quietly talk you out of your own boundary. So watch how it happens. A client no-shows and doesn't pay the fee. Instead of addressing it as a simple matter that it is, you find yourself building a formulation. Maybe the no-show is avoidance. Maybe the resistance to the fee is about a history of feeling controlled. Maybe asking for the money will damage the alliance that you have worked so hard to build. So each of those thoughts is plausible, and together they give you permission to say nothing. So the fee goes uncollected, and you tell yourself it was a clinical decision. Sometimes it actually really is, but often it's just avoidance dressed up in clinical language. So a client who repeatedly misses sessions without paying the cancellation fee is not presenting a mystery that requires a careful conceptualization. The policy exists, it's not being followed, and something needs to be said. That's a business conversation. So you are allowed to have it, and having it doesn't make you a worse therapist. Section 3, flexibility versus erosion. This brings me to the distinction I want you to hold on to, because it's the whole episode in 2 words. There is a difference between flexibility and erosion, and most therapists confuse the two. So, flexibility is a thoughtful, intentional exception. A client calls an hour before a session with a real emergency, and you waive the cancellation fee because you have the clinical relationship to assess that this is genuine and not a pattern. You made a decision, you looked at the situation, and you weighed it, and you chose to make an exception this one time. That is flexibility, and it's one of the privileges of running your own practice. You get to use judgment. Erosion is a different story. So, erosion is when your policy is technically still written down, still in your informed consent, still something that you would describe to a colleague, and yet it functionally does not apply because addressing it has become more uncomfortable than absorbing the cost. So the fee exists on paper and never gets collected. The session that started late always runs long. The Saturday texts always get answered because not answering feels worse than answering. And that is not flexibility. That just is a slow disappearance of a boundary that you meant to keep. So the reason this matters is that erosion does not feel like a decision while it's happening. It feels like kindness. It feels like meeting the client where they are. By the time you actually notice it, you have trained the client and yourself to treat your policies as suggestions. Rebuilding a boundary you have let erode is far harder than actually holding the one from the start. So, because now you are not setting a policy, you're changing one, and the client experiences the change as something being taken away. So, part 4, the one question that tells you which it is which. So, if flexibility and erosion can look identical from the outside, you need a way to tell them apart from the inside. There is one question that does it. So, ask yourself whether you made a choice or whether you avoided one. When you waive a fee because you assessed the situation and decided it was warranted, you made a choice. You could feel yourself deciding. And when you waive a fee because saving the words felt too hard, you avoided a choice. And the outcome happened to you rather than being something that you directed. And this question is useful precisely because it doesn't require you to be rigid. You're still allowed to bend and you're allowed to make exceptions, to read a situation and respond to it as a human being. So, what you are not allowed to do if you want this to work and to hold up over a career is to let discomfort be the thing that quietly makes your decisions for you. Discomfort is information, it's not a manager. Part 5, what to actually say. So let me get practical because I know that part of you actually came for is the word. So when a client pushes back on a policy, the most effective response is short, calm, and not defensive. The instinct to over explain is the thing that gets therapists into trouble. I'm going to give you language that stays brief on purpose. Start with acknowledgement, then state the policy, then stop talking. Something like, I understand this feels frustrating. This is how my practice works, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page going forward. So that's the whole script. You acknowledged this feeling, you held the line, and you didn't apologize for having a practice. Notice what is not in there. There is no long justification of why the policy exists. There's no string of reasons because reasons invite negotiation. And the moment that you start defending the policy, you've signaled that it is up for debate. And a client who wants it to be up for debate will keep the debate going. A boundary that is explained at length starts to sound like a boundary that you're not sure about. So if the client keeps pushing, you can repeat a version of the same thing without escalating. I hear you, and this is the policy. I'm happy to talk about how it's landing for you. That last sentence matters because it does something important. It keeps the door open to the clinical conversation while keeping the policy itself closed. How the client feels about the boundary is absolutely worth exploring together. Whether the boundary holds is not the thing on the table. So, one more thing on tone. The calmer you are and the less it reads as a fight, when your voice is steady and your face is not bracing for conflict, the client gets the message that this is simply how things are. Not a battle that you're nervous about losing. Your regulation does more work than your words. So, part 6, the reframe that makes this easier. So, I want to leave you with a reframe because the language only helps if the belief underneath it changes. So, holding a policy is not the opposite of good clinical care. It's actually part of it. A client who learns that your boundaries are real is a client who learns that the frame around the work is stable. The frame being stable is one of the conditions that makes the work possible in the first place. So people do their deepest work inside a container that they can trust to hold, and a container that gives way every time it's pushed is not one anyone can fully relax into. So when you hold a policy with steadiness and warmth, you are modeling something most of your clients struggle with in their own lives. And you're showing them that a person can hold a limit without becoming cold and without collapsing into guilt. For a lot of clients, watching you do that calmly is itself the intervention. You can't teach someone that boundaries and care can coexist if you are quietly abandoning yours. So, the next time a client pushes, try to remember that you're not choosing between the relationship and the policy. The way that you hold the policy is part of the relationship. If your policies feel shaky right now, the fix usually is not a longer cancellation clause. It's building the operational and financial foundation of your practice so that your boundaries are clear to you before a client ever tests them. That's a lot of what we work through in my foundations course, the program for therapists building a private practice in the first 90 days. You can find it at craftyourpractice.com/launch, and the link is in the description. See you next week. And if this was useful, subscribe so the next one finds you, and I'll see you in the next episode.